Within the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society rests a sealed document, dated March 1847, marked with a warning that still chills the researchers who discover it. The warning states it contains testimony too disturbing for public record. May God forgive what men have done. Inside those yellowed pages lies the testimony of 8 plantation owners, each suffering identical horrific injuries over a span of 11 years. Each man was castrated with surgical precision. Every attack occurred within 24 hours of a specific, unspeakable act. The perpetrator was never caught, never identified in any official record, but whispered accounts among freed slaves after the Civil War spoke of a man they called Silas the Silent. He was a field hand who could not scream, his vocal cords damaged beyond repair, a man who exacted a revenge so methodical and terrifying that even his fellow enslaved people feared to speak his name aloud. What you are about to hear is a reconstruction of the events that South Carolina authorities deliberately obscured. It reveals a pattern of violence so disturbing that it was easier to pretend it never happened than to confront what it revealed about the plantation system itself. Before we continue with the story of Silas and the 8 men who fell victim to his calculated fury, I need to ask you something. This channel exists to bring you the darkest, most unsettling true stories from American history, the ones the textbooks won't touch. If you appreciate content that doesn't shy away from historical horror, hit that subscribe button right now. I'm also curious, where are you listening from? Drop a comment with your state or city. Now, let's descend into one of the most disturbing cases of revenge in American history. The sealed testimony wasn't opened by accident. It was the persistence of a graduate student in 2003 that brought these events back to light. And what she found would haunt her research for years to come. The South Carolina Low Country in 1836 was a landscape of contradictions. Breathtaking natural beauty concealed systematic human suffering. The region's rice plantations generated extraordinary wealth for a small class of white landowners, wealth built entirely on the forced labor of thousands of enslaved African Americans who toiled in mosquito-infested fields where malaria and dysentery killed as readily as overwork. Charleston, 40 miles to the east, presented a facade of genteel Southern culture, grand balls, literary societies, churches with soaring steeples, while the surrounding countryside operated as an interconnected network of labor camps where human beings were bought, sold, bred, and worked to death with impunity. Stretching along the coastal plain was the Low Country plantation belt, where the intersection of tidal rivers and rich soil created ideal conditions for rice cultivation. But rice agriculture was punishing work. Enslaved workers stood knee-deep in water for hours, vulnerable to snakes, alligators, and disease. Their hands were torn bloody from the sharp-edged rice stalks. The summer heat was suffocating, the air thick with humidity and insects. Winter brought cold rains that soaked through thin clothing. On these plantations, the enslaved population significantly outnumbered their enslavers, sometimes by ratios of 20 or 30 to 1, which created a permanent atmosphere of fear among the white plantation owners. This fear manifested in brutal discipline, complex systems of surveillance, and punishments designed not just to control, but to terrorize. Into this world, in approximately 1815, a child was born who would be given the name Silas. His mother, according to fragmentary records, was named Patience, a woman who worked in the fields of the Rutledge plantation near Georgetown. His father's identity was never recorded, though plantation ledgers noted that Patience's child was mulatto, indicating a white father. This detail, seemingly minor, would prove significant in the rigid caste system of plantation society. The children of enslaved mothers and white fathers occupied a peculiar position, legally enslaved through their mother's status, yet bearing the features of their oppressor fathers, which often marked them for special resentment or unwanted attention. Silas grew up in the quarters, those crowded wooden structures where enslaved families lived in conditions that barely qualified as shelter. The buildings leaked in the rain, sweltered in summer, and provided little warmth in winter. Privacy was impossible. Families were separated on the whim of economic necessity, children sold away from parents, husbands from wives. The psychological toll of this instability was immeasurable. Yet within these communities, people created networks of support, passed down African traditions mixed with Christian teachings, sang songs that encoded messages of resistance, and found ways to maintain their humanity in a system designed to deny it. By age 7, Silas was working in the fields. Plantation records from the Rutledge estate, preserved in the South Carolina Historical Society, list him in 1822 as field hand, small tasks. By 10, he was doing full adult labor. Those who knew him in these years, according to later oral histories collected by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s, remembered a quiet boy who learned quickly and seemed to observe everything with unusual intensity. One elderly, formerly enslaved person interviewed in 1937 recalled, "My granddaddy told me about a boy named Silas who never spoke much even as a little child. Had light skin and gray eyes that looked right through you. Said that boy saw things other children didn't see. Remembered things it was safer to forget." The South Carolina Low Country had a reputation, even among other slave states, for exceptional brutality. The demographics, enslaved people outnumbering whites so dramatically, created paranoia among plantation owners, especially after the Denmark Vesey conspiracy of 1822, when Charleston authorities uncovered an alleged plot for a massive slave uprising. Though the conspiracy's full extent remains debated by historians, the white response was unambiguous. 35 black men were hanged, and restrictions on enslaved people became even more severe. The patrol system intensified, with armed white men riding the roads at night, stopping any black person found without a written pass. Literacy among enslaved people was already illegal. Now, even religious gatherings without white supervision were banned. The message was clear: resistance of any kind would be crushed with overwhelming violence. It was into this atmosphere of heightened repression and fear that Silas entered adolescence. He was 13 years old in 1828 when something happened that changed him forever. The exact details are unclear, lost to the deliberate silence that surrounded such events. But plantation records from the Rutledge estate show that in October of that year, Silas was treated by a doctor for severe throat injuries. The medical notation is clinical and brief: slave boy approximately 13. Damage to larynx and vocal cords. Cause undetermined. Recommended observation. A separate entry in the plantation ledger, in a different hand, notes, Silas unable to work, recovering from discipline incident. The word discipline covered multitudes of horrors on plantations, from whipping to branding to mutilation. From that point forward, Silas could not speak normally. According to accounts gathered decades later, he could make sounds, grunts, whispers, occasionally a strangled approximation of words, but his voice was destroyed. The damage was permanent. Whether this was the result of a beating, a deliberate punishment, or something else was never officially recorded. What is certain is that from age 13 onward, Silas the Silent, as he came to be known, moved through the plantation world as a presence both invisible and deeply unsettling. His inability to speak made him seem less threatening to some overseers, more disturbing to others. He was a ghost in plain sight, working without complaint, watching without comment. The Rutledge plantation, like others in the region, operated on a task system rather than gang labor. Enslaved workers were assigned specific tasks each day. A certain amount of rice to thresh, a field to hoe, ditches to dig, and once completed, their time was theoretically their own. In practice, tasks were often impossible to complete within daylight hours, forcing people to work late into the evening. But the system did allow for small pockets of autonomy, gardens where enslaved people grew their own food, opportunities to earn tiny amounts of money by selling surplus produce or fish caught in rivers. These small freedoms were crucial for psychological survival, creating spaces where people could exercise choice, however limited. Silas, according to oral histories, used his evening hours differently than most. He watched. He listened. His silence made people forget he was there. And in that invisibility, he learned things. He learned the patterns of the overseers, which ones drank heavily, which ones disappeared into the quarters at night. He learned the schedules of the patrol riders, the gaps in their routes. He learned which plantation owners visited other plantations and why. And he learned, though no one spoke of it openly, which men among the enslavers considered enslaved women and sometimes enslaved boys as sexual property, a right that came with ownership. The first incident occurred on a humid night in August 1836, though its full significance wouldn't be understood until much later. The victim was Nathaniel Grayson, a 32-year-old plantation owner whose property bordered the Rutledge estate. Grayson was found in his bedroom at dawn by his wife, conscious but in shock, blood soaking through the bedsheets. He had been castrated with what the doctor who treated him described as almost surgical precision. The bedroom door had been locked from the inside. The windows were shuttered and latched. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of struggle beyond the injury itself. Grayson, when he could speak, claimed he had woken to a hand over his mouth, a flash of metal, and pain so intense he lost consciousness. He saw nothing, heard nothing except breathing, steady, controlled breathing. The local sheriff, Benjamin Carr, investigated with the assistance of the Slave Patrol. Every enslaved person on Grayson's plantation was interrogated. Several were whipped on suspicion, a common practice designed more to reassert control than to extract information. Nothing useful emerged. Grayson's wife insisted no enslaved person had been in the house that evening. The house servants, questioned separately, confirmed they had been locked in their quarters as usual at nightfall, a practice Grayson followed religiously. The investigation stalled within days, and while rumors spread among white society, theories of revenge, whispers of abolition conspiracies, no arrest was made. What the sheriff's report didn't include, because Grayson refused to speak of it, was what had happened the previous afternoon. A field hand from the neighboring Rutledge plantation, a young man named Silas, had been loaned to Grayson for the day to assist with repairs to a rice mill. Such temporary transfers were common, a system of mutual assistance among plantation owners. The work had taken until evening, and rather than send Silas back in darkness, Grayson had kept him overnight in a storage shed near the main house. Grayson had visited that shed around 10 o'clock that evening. He was there for approximately half an hour. When he emerged, adjusting his clothing, Silas emerged behind him, moving slowly, his face unreadable. Grayson told his overseer to return Silas to the Rutledge plantation at first light. That was the last coherent order he gave before the attack. No connection was made. Grayson himself never mentioned Silas's presence on the property. To do so would have required explaining why he'd visited the shed late at night, and such an admission would have raised questions Grayson had no intention of answering. In the honor culture of the Southern plantation elite, certain things were understood but never acknowledged. Sexual access to enslaved people was simultaneously a casual practice and an unmentionable reality. To speak of it openly was to violate social codes that maintained the fiction of white gentility. So Grayson suffered in silence, eventually telling people he had been attacked by an unknown intruder, possibly a runaway slave who had mysteriously gained entry to his locked bedroom. Silas returned to the Rutledge plantation. He worked in the fields. He said nothing because he could say nothing. His face betrayed no emotion. Life continued. 18 months passed. Then, in February 1838, a second incident occurred. The victim this time was Thomas Wright, owner of a medium-sized plantation 12 miles south of the Rutledge property. Wright was 41 years old, married with 4 children, a respected member of his local church. He was found by his overseer in the plantation office, a small building separate from the main house, castrated in the same precise manner as Grayson. The door had been bolted from inside. Wright was unconscious from blood loss and shock. He survived but remained unable to provide any useful description of his attacker. He claimed he remembered nothing. He had been working late on account books and the next thing he knew he was waking in agony. The sheriff investigated again. This time the similarities to the Grayson case were noted. 2 plantation owners, both attacked in locked rooms, both suffering identical injuries, both unable to identify their attacker. Theories proliferated. An organized slave rebellion. A campaign by abolitionists. A disturbed individual with a grudge against the planter class. The investigation again focused on enslaved people in the area, particularly those who had demonstrated any independence of spirit or intelligence that might suggest capacity for such a crime. Several men were arrested, interrogated harshly, and held for weeks before being released for lack of evidence. Once again, a critical detail went unreported. 2 days before the attack, Wright had traveled to Georgetown to conduct business. While there, he had negotiated the short-term rental of an enslaved worker skilled in carpentry. The Rutledge plantation, looking to generate additional income, had begun renting out some of their more skilled enslaved workers to other plantation owners for temporary projects. Silas, despite his inability to speak, had learned carpentry skills and was considered a competent worker. He had been sent to Wright's plantation to repair damage to several outbuildings. The work took 3 days. Silas slept in a locked tool shed, ate meals brought to him by the plantation cook, and worked steadily from dawn to dusk. On the second evening, Thomas Wright visited the tool shed. He stayed for some time. When he left, Silas remained inside. The next day, Silas completed his work and returned to the Rutledge plantation. The day after that, Wright was found castrated in his office. No connection was made because no one was looking for a connection. The idea that an enslaved person, particularly one who could not speak, could not cry out, could not even tell anyone what was happening to him, might be capable of such calculated revenge, was unthinkable within the worldview of plantation society. Enslaved people were property, incapable of the kind of strategic thinking required for such acts. That they suffered was acknowledged with indifference, that they might respond with methodical violence was beyond consideration. But among the enslaved communities of the Low Country, whispers began. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be traced or used as evidence, but a pattern of knowing glances, careful silences. The name Silas was mentioned in contexts that suggested more than his carpentry skills. An elderly woman interviewed decades later recalled, "We knew there was somebody making those white men pay. Didn't know for certain who, but there was talk about a man who couldn't speak, who moved like a shadow. People were scared of him, but not the way you'd be scared of something evil. More like how you'd be scared of a storm. You know it's coming. You know it's powerful, and you just try to stay out of its way." By 1840, for plantation owners in the South Carolina Low Country had suffered the same fate. Each attack followed an identical pattern. Locked rooms, no sign of forced entry, surgical precision, no useful description of the attacker. The victims, Grayson, Wright, and now Edmund Talbot and Henry Prescott, had little in common on the surface. They were different ages, owned plantations of different sizes, belonged to different social circles. The only thread connecting them was geography. All lived within a 20-mile radius. All were part of the interconnected economic network of rice plantations that defined the region. The attacks had created a climate of fear among the planter class. Locked doors no longer felt secure. The presence of enslaved people in and around homes, once taken for granted, now generated paranoia. Some plantation owners began sleeping with loaded pistols. Others installed additional locks, hired extra overseers, increased the brutality of their control measures in hopes of intimidating potential attackers. The slave patrols intensified their night rides, stopping and questioning any black person found on the roads after dark. But the attacks continued, unpredictable in timing, but consistent in method. What the plantation owners didn't know, what they couldn't know, because they had never paid attention to the movement of enslaved workers between plantations, was that Silas had been present on each property in the days immediately before each attack. The Rutledge plantation had developed a profitable side business, renting out skilled enslaved workers, and Silas, with his carpentry abilities and his unsettling silence, was frequently loaned to other plantations for short-term projects. He was invisible, a tool rather than a person in the eyes of those who rented his labor. The pattern was never documented in any official record, but it was there. Silas would arrive at a plantation, work diligently for several days, sleep wherever he was assigned, usually a shed or storage building separate from the main slave quarters, and complete his tasks efficiently. And on some of these plantations, not all, but some, a particular owner would visit him in the night. What happened during those visits was never discussed, never recorded, existed only in the private hell of those who experienced it and the cold calculation of the one who remembered. Then Silas would return to the Rutledge plantation, and within 48 hours the man who had visited him would be found castrated, often in a locked room, the attack executed with such speed and silence that even a wife sleeping in the same house might hear nothing. The investigation, such as it was, remained fragmented because no one connected the attacks. Each incident was treated as separate, investigated by local authorities who communicated poorly with their counterparts in neighboring jurisdictions. Sheriff Carr, who had investigated the first 2 cases, was now convinced he was dealing with a serial attacker. But his attempts to coordinate a broader investigation met resistance. Plantation owners were reluctant to discuss the attacks openly, partly from shame at their injuries, partly from fear of encouraging copycat crimes or slave insurrections. The South Carolina Gazette published brief reports of violent incidents on low-country plantations, but deliberately avoided details that might inspire panic or provide information to potential attackers. In the enslaved communities, a different kind of knowledge circulated. People knew that certain plantation owners were being targeted. They knew that whatever was happening, it was justice of a kind their legal system would never provide. Enslaved women, particularly those who had been repeatedly raped by white men, spoke in encoded language about the silent one who made men pay. But they also knew that openly celebrating or even acknowledging these attacks would bring collective punishment. After each incident, slave patrols would sweep through the area, interrogating people, destroying property, inflicting violence randomly to reassert control. So the knowledge remained underground, shared in whispers, never written down, never spoken where it might be overheard. Silas himself remained an enigma even to those who lived alongside him in the Rutledge quarters. He worked steadily, ate his rations, slept in his assigned space. He had no family on the plantation. His mother patients had died of fever in 1830, and he had never known siblings. He formed no close friendships, participated minimally in the community life of the quarters. His silence was both explanation and barrier. How do you befriend someone who cannot speak, whose face shows no readable emotion, whose eyes seem to look through you rather than at you? An elderly man named Joshua, who had worked alongside Silas in the rice fields for years, told an interview in 1936 Silas wasn't like other folks. Something happened to him when he was young. Something that broke him inside even more than it broke his voice. He'd work all day in the heat, cutting rice until his hands bled, and he wouldn't make a sound. Overseers liked that at first. Thought he was broken good, but there was something in his eyes that made smart people nervous. He was watching, always watching, like he was seeing things the rest of us couldn't see. And when he looked at certain white men, there was something in that look that made you think of deep water, the kind that drowns you slow. The Rutledge plantation owners, the family that legally owned Silas, never suspected him of anything. He was valuable property, a skilled worker who could be rented out for additional income, quiet and obedient. If anything, his inability to speak made him seem more trustworthy. He couldn't spread rumors, couldn't organize resistance, couldn't even cry out if something happened to him. He was, in their eyes, the ideal slave, productive, silent, and utterly controlled. But control was an illusion. Silas had learned through years of observation and bitter experience how plantation society functioned. He understood the rhythms of plantation life, the patterns of white movement and black restriction. He knew that enslaved people were expected to be in certain places at certain times, that deviation from routine invited suspicion and punishment. He knew that his silence, which made him vulnerable, also made him forgettable. Overseers would speak freely in his presence, discussing matters they would never mention around enslaved people they believed could gossip. White men would use him and then dismiss him from their minds, confident that a mute slave posed no threat. They were catastrophically wrong. By 1842, the count had reached 6. 2 more plantation owners, Robert Finch and Charles Hammond, had joined the list of victims. The attacks were no longer isolated incidents that could be dismissed as random violence. The Charleston Mercury published an editorial calling for a coordinated investigation, suggesting that a disturbed individual or organization of malcontents was targeting the plantation class. Rewards were offered for information. The governor authorized additional militia resources to support local law enforcement, but the investigation continued to flounder because the victims, almost without exception, refused to provide certain information. None would discuss their activities in the hours immediately before the attacks. None would acknowledge the presence of particular enslaved workers on their properties. To do so would have required admitting to behaviors that, while common, were supposed to remain unspoken. The honor culture of the Southern elite valued reputation above almost all else. A man might rape enslaved women and boys with impunity, but to acknowledge such acts publicly was to lose standing in society. Better to suffer in silence than to admit the truth. This silence protected Silas more effectively than any deliberate plan. The pattern was there, waiting to be discovered, but no one with the authority to investigate was willing to look in the direction that would reveal it. And so the attacks continued, each one a precise, methodical act of revenge that left its victim alive but destroyed, capable of knowing what had been done to him, but powerless to name his attacker. Just when the investigation seemed hopelessly stalled, an unexpected witness emerged who would threaten to unravel everything. Her name was Dinah, a house servant on the Hammond plantation, and she had seen something the night Charles Hammond was attacked. Something she couldn't forget, no matter how much she wanted to. Dinah was 34 years old in 1842, a woman who had spent her entire life enslaved on various low-country plantations. She had been sold twice, once as a child when her original owner died, once as a young woman when a plantation went bankrupt. The Hammond plantation was her third place of bondage. As a house servant, she occupied a complicated position in plantation hierarchy. House slaves generally had better food, better clothing, and less physically demanding work than field hands. But this proximity to white owners came with its own terrors. House servants saw and heard things, marital conflicts, financial troubles, private cruelties, that made them uniquely vulnerable. Knowledge was dangerous for enslaved people. Witnessing things you weren't supposed to see could get you sold, beaten, or killed. On the night of Charles Hammond's attack, Dinah had been sleeping in a small room off the kitchen, as was customary for the cook and primary house servant. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, she woke to use the chamber pot and heard something. A sound so faint she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. It was a footstep on the stairs leading to the second floor where the family bedrooms were located. The staircase was old and certain steps creaked predictably. Dinah knew those sounds intimately, had climbed those stairs countless times each day. What she heard was someone moving slowly, carefully, testing each step to minimize noise. She should have stayed in her room. Every instinct of survival told her to remain silent, to see nothing, to know nothing. But curiosity, or perhaps some deeper intuition, drew her to the doorway. The house was dark except for a single candle she lit, shielding its light with her hand. She moved to where she could see the staircase. A figure stood at the top, barely visible in the darkness. The silhouette was male, lean, moving with careful deliberation toward Hammond's bedroom. For a moment, Dinah's heart stopped, thinking she was witnessing a murder in progress. Then the figure turned slightly, and candlelight caught his face for just an instant. She recognized him. Silas, the carpenter from the Rutledge plantation, who had been working on the property for the past 3 days, repairing the gallery railings and several window frames. He had been locked in the tool shed each night, or so everyone assumed. Clearly, he had found a way out. As Dinah watched, frozen in her doorway, Silas reached Hammond's bedroom door. She expected it to be locked. Hammond locked his door every night, paranoid about the recent attacks on plantation owners, but the door opened silently. Silas slipped inside. The door closed. Dinah stood paralyzed with indecision. She should wake someone, should raise an alarm, but something stopped her. Perhaps it was the memory of Hammond's visits to the quarters, the way he selected women with the casual authority of someone choosing fruit at market. Perhaps it was the knowledge that whatever was about to happen, she wanted no part of it. Perhaps it was recognition that the silent man who had just entered that bedroom was enacting a kind of justice the legal system would never provide. She returned to her room. She lay awake, listening. The house remained quiet. No screams, no struggle, no sounds of violence, just silence, deep and complete. When Hammond's agonized moaning began just before dawn, Dinah was already in the kitchen starting the fire, preparing breakfast. She was there when Hammond's wife began screaming, when the doctor was summoned, when chaos erupted through the household. And when the sheriff arrived to question everyone, Dinah said nothing about what she had seen, nothing about the figure on the stairs, nothing about Silas entering the locked bedroom. But silence has a way of festering, especially when weighted with knowledge that might save lives or condemn them. Dinah carried what she knew through the remainder of 1842 and into 1843, watching Silas when he occasionally returned to the Hammond plantation for additional work, observing him with a mixture of fear and something close to awe. He never acknowledged her with anything more than the briefest glance, but she felt certain he knew that she had seen him. They existed in a state of mutual silence, each holding knowledge that could destroy the other. The seventh attack occurred in November 1843. The victim was Daniel Merrick, a particularly brutal plantation owner whose cruelty was notorious even by the standards of the region. Merrick owned a large plantation near the Wackamore River. More than 40 slaves worked rice fields that generated substantial profits. He was known for creative punishments, thumb screws, the stocks, brutal whippings for minor infractions. He was also known for his appetites, which extended to both enslaved women and younger men. The enslaved community on his plantation lived in constant terror. Silas had been sent to Merrick's plantation in early November to construct a new storage building for rice harvesting equipment. The project required 10 days of work. Silas slept in a locked corn crib, took his meals away from the other enslaved people, and worked with mechanical efficiency. On the third night of his stay, Merrick visited the corn crib. What happened during that visit was known only to 2 people. But 9 days later, when Silas had completed his work and returned to the Rutledge plantation, Merrick was found by his overseer in the plantation office, castrated with the now familiar precision. By this point, 7 plantation owners had been attacked. The pattern should have been obvious, but it remained hidden because the necessary information was fragmented across different plantations, different jurisdictions, different social circles that communicated poorly. The victims had formed an informal association, meeting occasionally to share information and theories, but their shame and reluctance to discuss certain details prevented them from seeing the pattern. They knew they were being targeted by someone with detailed knowledge of their homes and habits, but they couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge the common thread. That common thread was Silas, the silent carpenter who moved between plantations like a ghost, working diligently, observing carefully, remembering everything. He had developed his method over years. Identify the locations where he was most vulnerable. Determine the layout of plantation houses through casual observation during his work. Note the patterns of patrols and overseer movements. Then, when the time came, he would escape from whatever shed or building where he was locked at night. Locks were simple devices, easily manipulated with the right tools. And as a carpenter, he had access to tools and make his way to the house of his target. Getting inside locked houses required patience and careful observation. During his days working on a property, Silas would note which windows had loose frames, which doors had inadequate locks, where keys were kept. He learned that many plantation houses, for all their grandeur, were poorly secured. Locks were meant to keep enslaved people out, but they were often old, poorly maintained, opened with skeleton keys that a skilled carpenter could replicate. Windows could be shimmed open from outside if you knew which ones had loose fittings. Once inside, Silas moved with the confidence of someone who had studied his terrain. He knew where floorboards creaked, which rooms were occupied, where servants slept, and he knew his targets would be alone, or if with wives, those wives would be heavy sleepers, often aided by the laudanum that many wealthy women of the era used regularly. He would enter the bedroom silently, approach the sleeping man, and in one swift motion place a cloth soaked in chloroform, stolen from plantation medical supplies during his daytime work, over his victim's face. The man would struggle briefly, then lose consciousness. Silas would work quickly then, using surgical tools he had carefully acquired and hidden. The castration was performed with a precision that suggested medical knowledge, though where Silas had learned such skills remained mysterious. Within minutes he would be gone, slipping back out of the house the way he had entered, returning to his locked shed to wait out the remaining hours before dawn. The chloroform explained why victims remembered so little. The surgical precision explained why most survived. Silas had no interest in murder, which would bring far more intense investigation. His revenge was specific, to take from these men what they had taken from him and others, to inflict a permanent reminder of their crimes, to transform sexual predators into damaged, broken creatures who would never assault anyone again. But Dinah's knowledge remained a ticking bomb. In early 1844, she made a decision that would change everything. She approached Reverend Thomas Clayton, a Presbyterian minister who served several low-country plantation churches and had a reputation as a reformer who occasionally, very carefully, spoke about the moral problems of slavery. Dinah requested a private conversation, an unusual request from an enslaved person to a white minister. Clayton, intrigued and somewhat suspicious, agreed to meet her in the Hammond Plantation Chapel. What Dinah told him that afternoon in February 1844 was fragmentary and careful. She didn't identify Silas by name initially, but she described seeing a man in the Hammond house the night of the attack, a man who shouldn't have been there. She described his silence, his careful movement, the way he had entered a locked room. She told Clayton she believed this same man was responsible for the other attacks, that he moved between plantations, that he was exacting revenge for something terrible. She didn't explicitly say what that something was. To do so would require acknowledging the systematic sexual violence that pervaded the plantation system, and such acknowledgement could get her killed. But she hinted, and Clayton, who was more perceptive than many of his peers, understood. Clayton faced an impossible choice. If he reported what Dinah had told him to the authorities, she would certainly be punished, possibly killed for not coming forward immediately. The perpetrator would likely be caught and executed. But Clayton had enough moral imagination to understand that what he was dealing with wasn't simple criminality. It was revenge for sustained, systematic abuse. He asked Dinah why she was telling him this now, months after witnessing the attack. Her answer was simple. Because there's going to be more. I can see it in him when he passes through. And maybe if somebody knows, if somebody understands what's really happening, something can change. Clayton made a decision that defied every social convention of his time and place. He said nothing to the authorities. Instead, he began his own quiet investigation, traveling between plantations, speaking to enslaved people under the guise of religious ministry, gathering stories that confirmed what Dinah had suggested. He learned about a silent carpenter named Silas. He learned about plantation owners who visited locked sheds at night. He learned about a pattern of horror that the white establishment refused to acknowledge because acknowledging it would require confronting the deepest moral rot of the slavery system. What Clayton didn't anticipate was that his investigation would draw attention. In a society built on surveillance and control, a white minister asking careful questions about plantation owners and their private behavior raised alarms. By summer of 1844, Clayton found himself called before a committee of concerned citizens in Georgetown, questioned about his activities, warned that his interference in plantation discipline was unwelcome. He was told, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that his continued service as a minister in the Low Country depended entirely on his discretion and his willingness to support, not question, the established social order. One committee member, a prominent plantation owner named Augustine Sheffield, was particularly direct. "We understand you've been asking questions about matters that don't concern the spiritual welfare of anyone, Reverend. Questions that suggest you've forgotten your place and purpose here. That can be corrected, or it can be concluded. The choice is yours." Clayton understood the threat. He stopped his investigation, or appeared to, but he kept detailed private journals documenting everything he had learned, writing in a personal shorthand that he believed would protect the information if his papers were ever seized. These journals, discovered in a Charleston estate sale in 1998, provide the most complete contemporary account of what was actually happening in the Low Country between 1836 and 1847. In one entry from August 1844, Clayton wrote, "I have learned the identity of the man they seek, though they know not whom they seek. He is called Silas, property of the Rutledge estate, a carpenter of some skill who cannot speak. I have learned why he cannot speak, the result of violence inflicted upon him as a boy of 13, the nature of which I cannot bring myself to write, even in this private record. I have learned what has been done to him repeatedly since by men who saw his silence as invitation rather than injury. And I have learned what he has done in response. God forgive me, I cannot condemn him. The law would hang him without hesitation. But what law protects him? What justice exists for one such as he? I am meant to preach forgiveness and redemption. Yet I find myself hoping he is never caught, that his terrible justice continues until every man who has violated him pays in full. Meanwhile, Silas continued his work, unaware that anyone had begun to piece together the pattern. The Rutledge plantation continued to profit from renting out their skilled carpenter, and Silas continued to move between properties, a silent presence that white society had learned to ignore completely. But something was changing in him. According to those who observed him during these years, the elderly, formerly enslaved people interviewed in the 1930s spoke of a man who seemed to be slowly disappearing even as he remained physically present. He got thinner, one woman recalled, like he was burning up from the inside. His eyes got darker, deeper. You'd look at him and feel like you were looking into a well with no bottom. Some folks started avoiding him, not because they thought he'd hurt them, but because being near him felt like being near something that had already died, but forgot to stop moving. The eighth and final attack occurred in March 1847, and it would prove different from all the others in ways that would finally force the truth into the open. The target was Jonathan Caldwell, a 47-year-old plantation owner whose property sat along the Black River, one of the most profitable rice-growing regions in South Carolina. Caldwell was wealthy even by planter standards, owning more than 60 enslaved people and extensive land holdings. He was also a member of the state legislature, a position that gave him considerable political influence and protection. Unlike the previous victims, who had been reluctant to discuss their attacks publicly, Caldwell was known for his arrogance and his belief that his political connections made him untouchable. In early March 1847, Caldwell contracted with the Rutledge plantation to borrow Silas for a month-long project, the construction of a new overseer's house and the renovation of several slave quarters that had fallen into disrepair. It was an ambitious project that would require Silas to work on the Caldwell plantation for an extended period, longer than any of his previous assignments. The Rutledge estate manager, pleased with the substantial rental fee Caldwell was offering, agreed immediately. Silas was transported to the Caldwell plantation on March 3, along with the tools and materials he would need. The Caldwell plantation was larger and more brutal than most. The overseer, a man named Horace Strickland, was notorious for his violence. He carried a whip at all times and used it freely. The enslaved population lived in constant fear, worked past the point of exhaustion, and suffered punishments for infractions, real and imagined. Several people had died in the fields in recent years from overwork and untreated injuries. The atmosphere was oppressive, heavy with the kind of despair that comes from knowing no relief is possible, no escape available. Silas was assigned to sleep in a small workshop separate from the main quarters, a building where tools were stored and minor repairs completed. It was a wooden structure with a heavy lock on the door, bars on the